Welcome Monday night shir, the devastation of the Crusades and the saddest halachic discussion, debate. It's Bahar B'chukaisai, it's the week of the Klolos. It's the week of the Rebbe would never say curses. By the Rebbe there was brachas and then there was, the opposite of brachas. There was life, there was opposite of life. The Rebbe was very careful with his wording. But the Klolos are there. The simple reading of the psukim is highly frightening. And the Mefarshim point out that actually historically these curses all happened, it all took place. It's well known the klolos of this week's parsha took place by the first Beis HaMikdash, the ones in Kisave took place by the second. But the two Botei Mikdash, the two Beis HaMikdashim being destroyed was not the beginning and not the end of Jewish tragedy. And so in theme of this week's parsha of the Klolos, also in theme of the Crusades happening during the days of Sfiras HaOmer, and in fact some of the customs of Avelis that we have today are directly linked to the catastrophe of the Crusades. And also I've had a hard couple of days, so I'm in a melancholic mood, so This is the menu today. Chef special. They say both. There were more than two. There were quite a few. As far as the Middle Ages, one of the first catastrophes happened. If we're talking around about 1,000 years ago, 1033 in Fez. In 1033 in Fez, there was the Fez massacre. It's known as the Fez massacre. Thousands of Jews, between 5,000 and 10,000 Jews, don't know the exact number. We don't know the exact number. Were murdered by Muslims, by a Muslim ruler who was anti-Semitic. And that was one of the great, horrible catastrophes in the Middle Ages. Yet, not much is spoken about it because it was eclipsed by what's going to happen afterwards. That was 1033 in Fez, in Morocco. In 1066, okay, so we're already in the times of the Rishonim, meaning you have the era of the Go'anim. After the Gemara was sealed around the year 450, there was an era of 100 years of the Rabbanan Savaroi, who finished editing the Gemara, final touches. They say there were even chunks of the Gemara that were placed in by them. That lasted 100 years, and then the Go'anim begin. The Go'anim are centered in Bavel, in the yeshivas of Sura and Pumbedisa, and the Go'anim last until they say the famous Go'in Rav Hai Gon died in the year 1038. In the year 1038. There were some Rosh Yeshiva after him, but he was the last famous Goin, Rav Hai Gon, 1038. In Bavel, during that time, Rabbeinu Gershom was alive in Mainz, in Germany. He passes away around there. 1040 is the year the Maharshal gives. Others say it was 1028, fine. Around that time, Rabbeinu Gershom passes. And then begins the era of the Rishonim. Who decides that? The Raavad. Not the Raavad who argues on the Rambam and the Rif, but there were three Raavids alive at the same time. As the Adoris and the Chidor refer to them, Raavad Harishan, Raavad Hasheni, Raavad Hashlishi. There's a famous Raavad, the Kabbalist, the scholar who argues on the Rambam and the Rif, and he's the famous Raavad. But he had a shver, his father-in-law, the Baal HaEshkol, who lived in Provence, was also known as the Raavad, Rabbi Avram Av Bezdin. But there was another Raavad at the same time in Spain who was a philosopher, wrote a sefer, Emunah Rama, and he was also a historian, and he wrote the Seder HaKabbalah, or the Sefer HaKabbalah, and that is an ever so important work on Yiddish history. And in it, the Raavad writes that after the Go'onim ceased, a new era began. Now he doesn't call it the Rishonim, the early ones. Now we look back, we call them the Rishonim. He labels them the Rabbonim. The Gaonim were over, the Rabbonim began. And he says the Rabbonim, at least in Sfard, because this rival's in Spain, so as far as the Sfardim, he says the first three Rabbonim, the first three Rishonim, were Reb Shmuel HaNagid in southern Spain. And in northern Africa, Rabbeinu Chanano and the Rif. Rabbeinu Chanano, pardon me, and Rav Nissim Goin. And the Rif learned under both of them. Rabbeinu Chanano and Rav Nissim Goin had a joint yeshiva. Could you imagine a yeshiva today, not just with one world-class yeshiva, but with two? Imagine how many students would go there. And they had a yeshiva in Tunisia, in Al-Kairoun in Tunisia, and the Rif studied by both of them. So you have Rav Nissim Goin, you have Rabbeinu Chanano in northern Africa, and you have Rab Shmuel HaNagid in Spain. The Ravid says these three were the beginning of the Rabbonim, the era of the Rishonim, the Rabbonim. And this Rab Shmuel HaNagid, who was a famous scholar, he was actually a leader of the army of the Caliph in Grenada. And he was the Rav of the community, the Rosh Yeshiva, extremely wealthy. I mean, he was a leader, he was a general of the army. He was a poet. So many stories about Rab Shmuel HaNagid and his legacy. He has a son, Rabbi Yosef HaNagid, who succeeds his father in Grenada. And he was actually married to the daughter of Rav Nissim Goin. Right? So there was a nice little shidduch over there. And unfortunately, he was murdered in the Grenada massacre in 1066. He's about 30 years old, 31 years old or so, young man. He was already famous, not only for his wealth, but literally as a successor of his father. People would, like his father, he paid for people to move, come, study, explore Torah, write works, I'll support you. And there were many who were envious. The Goyim were envious and jealous of him and his stature. And the mob broke out. It was the 9th day of Tevis, 1066, the Grenada massacre. I've seen estimates be between 500 and 4,000 of how many people were killed in the Grenada massacre. Again, this is the Muslims. This is before the Christians are going to turn against us in the Crusades. This was 1066. It's actually fascinating that in the Bahag, the Baal Halachas Gedolos quotes something, the Megillus Tainus, a list of days. There's a list of days throughout the year that the Gemara discusses that you're not allowed to fast, a Yomim Tovim. There's another list of days that you're supposed to fast because very sad events occurred on these days historically. And they're all brought to Shulchan Aruch. From the Baal Halachas Gedolos. And on each day it says to fast, and it says what happened, like why should you fast on that day? And when it comes to the 9th of Tevis, it says it's a fast, but it says the reason is not revealed. Very strange. The only fast that the reason is not revealed. Remember this? So theories abound, right? How intriguing is that? There's a fast day, a national fast day. Okay, even not everyone may be fasted, but we can't tell you the reason. The reason isn't known, a mystery. So theories abound. The Baruch Tam, Yozeda, right? He believes that the day has to do with Shimon HaKippur. Shimon HaKippur, Peter, from the early days of Yoshka. Peter, according to many Jewish sources, was a frum Jew who infiltrated into this new religion, and his purpose was to make it clear that this is not authentic Judaism, this is different, in order the average Jew should no longer be confused and should see black and white that this is black, not Judaism. And he saved many people through that. And this is a big discussion historically, what Peter's story in fact was. But he believes that his yahrzeit was Tes Tevis. It's a sad day. Anyhow, theories abound. Comes the Ravid in his Seder HaKabbalah, in his Sefer Kabbalah, and he says, the rabbis enacted the fast centuries and centuries before the massacre in Grenada. But it was done with Ruach HaKodesh. They made a fast the 9th of Teves. They didn't reveal what happened because it hadn't happened yet. They didn't reveal because it hadn't happened yet. But the date was going to be so significant that the Chacham in Baruch Kadsham already established it as a fast before it even happened. Now that's like, very bizarre. Where do you have to mourn before destruction happens? You could be happy before something good happens, but to mourn, right, like the Rashi in Parshas Bereshis, when you have reason to be happy, your children are born, you're happy. God forbid something happens, so then you mourn then. But to mourn before it happens? But apparently you see from the Ravid that this atrocity of the Grenada massacre was so severe, it like shook the entire, Sephardic side of Yiddishkeit, that it was so severe that he felt that it makes sense to say that this day was already foreseen centuries ago. Anyhow, that's 1066. Again, in the Muslim world. A couple centuries later, we're in Germany. The Yidden came to Germany. They say it was during the 800s when they ascended to Germany from Italy. The Jews had been in Spain well before. The Abarbanel writes that his family came there at the end of the first Beis HaMikdash to Spain. We also have records that after the second Churban, Titus had acquaintances in Spain, and they had asked Titus to send some of the prisoners of war to come help build up the colonies of Spain. So Spain goes way back when, but Germany was later, the 700s, the 800s. The Kloinimus family was a famous family that went up. And it was the year 1096 when the first crusade occurs. It was the year 1096, known in the Jewish count as the year Tatnu, 4000, Tatnu, 856. Corresponds to the year 1096. That was the first crusade. There's going to be a second one 50 years later, 1146, 1147. There'll be a third one about 40 years after that, in 1189. Those were the big three, and there were a couple other smaller ones as well. And this was a Christian attack against the Muslims, but unfortunately the Yidden did not escape. Right? Not to be attacked at all. Maybe that the Yidden were hoping for, but the Eibishter, unfortunately, didn't take us down that route. And there were horrible massacres. The Crusades were not the only atrocities that occurred in Germany. In the end of the 1200s, in 1298 was the notorious Rindfleisch massacres. And it was in southern Germany. There was a nobleman by the name of Rindfleisch. He said he had visions from heaven, right? As Christians, it's their sacred duty to attack the Jews, and the Jews are Yoshka killers, and the Jews were accused of interfering with some of the church's activities, the wafers and this and that they were attacking, and they were sacrilegious, and the Jews got to go. And the numbers there I've seen are in between 25,000. Some say maybe even up to 100,000. The Maram of Rottenburg, he had already died in captivity by this time, but many of his students, the Mordechai and his family, the Agois Maimonides, many of the Maram of Rottenburg students were all killed. The Rosh survived. We know the Rosh had fled to Spain, right? And he met with the he met with the Rashba in Barcelona. The year the Rosh fled, not clear. It was around the year 1300. So if it was before 1298, then it was a good move, naturally, on his part. Obviously, the Eibishter Mahavayim Mitzad the Gever Kainono, the Eibishter led him away. But I don't know the exact year the Rosh actually left Germany. But his close friends, his close, good buddies, the other students of the Maram of Rottenburg, massacred. And that was in 1298. And those numbers seem to actually outdo the First Crusade. The First Crusade is not going to hit the number of the Rindfleisch massacres. But nonetheless, what appears is that The Crusades opened up the door for all future attacks of the Christians against the Jews. It was Pesach that Sinner opened up the pipe. It may not have been the worst, but it was the first. And it allowed, it encouraged, it gave room. Later, Christians would always say, you know, we're picking up where the Crusades left off. If our ancestors did it, we can do it as well. And I think all historians agree that the Holocaust was a result. It may have been many centuries later, almost 1,000 years after the First Crusade. It's directly linked. It's just down, it's a link, it's a chain of links, and it's directly linked to the Crusades. So, although numbers-wise it wasn't the largest, but it opened up the pipe, it created this possibility and the precedent from which all future Christian attacks against the Jews can be based on. So what was the story? What was it all about? So the Christian kingdom had been divided between the East and the West. The Eastern kingdom was based out of Constantinople, today known as Istanbul. And in Kusta, Constantinople, they became known as the Byzantine Empire, so they're the Eastern Orthodox of the Christians. Whereas in the West, in Italy and Rome, you have the Pope, you have Catholic Christianity. So you have the Eastern Kingdom, the Western Kingdom. The Western Kingdom originally went down around the time when the Gemara was sealed. Years later, they wanted to recreate the Western Kingdom, and they did, and it became known as the Holy Roman Empire. That happened around the year 800, and it lasted about 1,000 years. And that was supposed to be a continuation, a resurrection of the Western Christian kingdom. Either way, so it was in the year 1095, and so you have the Holy Roman Empire, which is Germany, Italy to the west, and you have the Byzantine Empire based out of Constantinople in the east. The Muslims had already controlled North Africa for centuries, but now they controlled the Levant, the Middle East, and they were making their way very close to Constantinople. It was a big threat. So the Eastern Kingdom turns to the Western Kingdom and says, we need your help. Let's put our differences aside. Let all the Christians band together as brothers and push back the Islamic infidels before they're heading too close. Let's knock them down. And by the way, we'll reclaim Israel, reclaim the holy city of Jerusalem and all of the holy cities that they felt were holy in Eretz Yisrael. And the Pope was excited about this, about unifying both kingdoms and pushing back the Muslims. It kind of was a win-win on every front as far as Christian beliefs. And there was something known as the Council of Clermont, where there was a group of noblemen, the nobility of Christian society, and the Pope there gave a famous speech and really encouraged that the Western Christians should aid their brothers in the East against the Muslims. And many bishops spoke to their populaces, and many knights and warriors were encouraged to travel east. This was a holy war, a crusade, a jihad, a holy war, to knock back the infidels who are trying to harm us, to reclaim Israel, etc., etc. It seems, now I wasn't there, but historians today say, based on what was recorded pretty much at the time by the Goyim, that the official mantra, the official aim and goal and directives was not to harm the Jews. The Jews ought to be protected. However, there were a few unscrupulous fellows, one by the name of Peter the Hermit. He was a Galach. And there was another guy, a Count, Emiko, I think his name was. And the two of them created their own little army of crusaders, separate from the masses. And their armies were really just the mob. Unsophisticated folk, poor fellows who understood that The more they massacre, those that they massacre, they're free to take the plunder. So they have a promise of wealth, a promise of activity and excitement, and most importantly, a promise in the world to come. Straight to heaven, straight to heaven. One of these people gave a drush and said, every Christian has to kill at least one Jew. If you want to have a hope to go to heaven, at least one Jew has to die at your hands. Now, some believe that Peter the Hermit definitely had a group of people, unsophisticated, untrained warriors, and his whole army ended up fizzling out. The Chevra died on their way. They never even made it to Constantinople. There are those that contend that his army, his group of Lo Yutzlachs of Shlomils, actually did not harm the Jews, and they blame it all on Count Emiko. They blame it all on him. Others say it's not true. Peter the Hermit's Chevra also hurt the Jews. Fact of the matter is, there was a group of hoodlums, of peasants, a mob, and they felt, we're traveling all the way to Israel, deep into Turkey, to fight off the infidels for a promise in the world to come. We have infidels next door to us, all of our neighbors. In the Rhineland, in that part of Germany, all the cities there were full of Jews. Doesn't make any sense. We're going to knock off the infidels 1,000 miles away, and the next door neighbors, we let them off the hook. So they first turned to their Jewish neighbors. It was already during this time of the year, 1096. It was after Pesach, so the winter was right, and the winter is cold. They have to do it when the weather's nice. So they waited till it started to warm up. And it was during Iyar, the 8th of Iyar, they hit the city of Speyer, where the Shapiros usually come from. On the 23rd of Iyar, 2 weeks later, they hit Worms, known as Vermeise. They hit it twice, Chav Gimel Iyar, and again Rosh Chodesh Sivan. On the third day of Sivan, they hit Mainz, Magense, and they hit it again on Shavuos. And then they went to Cologne. When they first came to the city of Cologne, the Duke gathered all the Jews into his castle, which happened a few times, and offered them protection. And originally it worked. It worked for about a month, until the mob broke through the Count's defenses, the Duke's, the nobleman's defenses, and massacred all the Jews of Cologne. And so too many cities in the Rhineland, in that area of southern Germany. The Crusaders, it took them a couple years till they finally made it to Israel. It was 1099. And many Christians lost their lives, much more than they anticipated and expected. When they came to Jerusalem, pretty much every Muslim was murdered, and the Jews that were there in Jerusalem were taken together into the shul, and the shul was burnt. It was a horrible affair, the Crusades. If you join me in number 2, this is from the Seder HaDairis. The Seder HaDairis in number 2. Rabbi Chil Halpern, 300 years ago. He's quoting from the Tzemach David. Right, so, many have commented the Jews were always concerned about the halacha, the law, and so few of them were actually concerned about dates, places, history, what actually occurred. But there were a number of Yidden who did make it their life's mission to do so. The Ravid wrote the Seder HaKabbalah. The Tzemach David is Reb David Gans, student of the Ramah. Before him, Reb Avram Zakuta, the great rabbi and astronomer in Spain, Portugal. So he has the Sefer Yuchsin, right? So there's a number of them. And of course, there's the Seder HaDairis, Rabbi Chil Halpern, a wondrous Sefer. And he does a lot of quoting from before, but he has some very important tidbits that he points out. And he writes as follows: Tzemach David Kosev, the Tzemach David Gans writes, in Ashkenaz in Germany, in Sarfas in France, in Bohemia, in Angleterre could be England, okay, so Italy and Ungarn would be Hungary. Nergu v'nishchetu al kiddush Hashem kamer avavis. A number of myriads, tens of thousands. Some give the number 25,000. It's It's a bit of a guess, I guess, because Kama Revolvers could be 20,000 or 30,000, so choose a number in the middle. I don't know. But Verabim Heimisu Esas, we're going to talk about this. Besides the many that were slain, there were many that took their own lives. Their own lives, their sons and their daughters, the Eishes Cheka, their wives, Na'adim and lads, Basulas, little girls, Kalas, Chasanim, young marrieds. V'loy Hoyasrid, there were no remnants, no survivors, Kimus Emis for a small amount. And there's a slicha, bris krusa was made for this gzeira. Ad kam l'shonoi. Says Rabbi Yechiel Halpern, al-keinu, it seems to me, ma'ashakasav b'shalshelas hakabola. Shalshelas hakabola is another important historical work. Rabbi Gedalia Yichya, Italy in the 1500s, although his anecdotes and much of his information has been questioned as to the accuracy of the information, but it says over there that those that were killed and drowned were more than 5,000. Says Rabbi Yechiel Halpern, it's a mistake. 5,000. It was much more than that. It was a number of myriads. Many tens of thousands were killed. So it was a huge calamity. A huge, huge calamity for Ashkenazi Jewry. If you look at number 3 on the left, there's another entry in the Seder Adoris. He says, I found Kosev B'Sefer Yoshana, I found in an old manuscript. It's a pirish on the Machzer and on Slichas that in the decrees of Tatno in 1096, Kama B'nei Adam, a few people, Choshev people in the city of Metz, saw 3 Zkanim, 3 elders walking in the street, in the Jewish street. And they said, B'kol Noim, and these 3 elders that no one recognized, no one had seen them before, 3 strangers. They raised their voice and they say in a beautiful voice, Ala kol yiskadol v'yiskadosh. V'holchon, the group of people asked Rab Shimon HaGadol, the Beis Av Shalonu, the head of the family, Maha Maisa Azeh, what was this story? He told them, Ahuvai, my beloved, those elders you described you never saw before. You know why? They don't live here. It's Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yankov, and they were warning us because there's a Gzeira coming. The kablu aleim din shemaim, accept upon yourselves the din of heaven. Or the kiblu, they were makabel on themselves the din of heaven. Or Paul, when they affected beside with secret that Ashmedai, the king of the Shadim, came with a big army to greet the enemies and to fight on behalf of the Jews. Okay? And he gave a simon to the Jews. If the blood will be red, it's going to be good. If it will be yorek, yellowish green, then what is, or what was. And then they found that Ashmedai Taka had been killed. Don't ask me the meaning of this, because I have no idea. This is a mystery of the old Chasidei Ashkenaz. Then he says, V'chein hu kabod, this is the tradition that Reb Shimon HaGadol Hanal begged from God, I don't want to see the suffering. They say the Minchas Alaz of the Munkatsheh before he died in 1930. Last time I mentioned 36, and the Mendele, he corrected me. It was 37, sometime around there. Apparently he said, there's going to be a choshech. I want to leave before it comes. So there's a Kabbalah that Reb Shimon HaGadol asked from God, Shelo yirah gzeira. Like Moshe Rabbeinu said in Balais, I don't want to see it. And he died 3 days before it happened. According to this, Reb Shimon HaGadol died 3 days before the atrocities of the First Crusade, not only seeing what was going to happen, but publicizing to the others what's going to happen, and begging from God, I don't want to see it, let me die. Here's the issue. This Reb Shimon HaGadol was a friend of Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom passed away 50 years, according to one opinion, 70 years before the First Crusade. How is this Reb Shimon HaGadol still alive? As kids, you heard the story of the Jewish Pope, the famous story of Elchanan, the Jewish Pope. So he was the son, allegedly, of this Reb Shimon HaGadol. And allegedly, the Jewish Pope, after he came back to Judaism, he was killed by the Crusades. But to say the father, the whole thing's a mystery. Reb Shimon HaGadol would have been, who knows, like 130 years old at the time. I mean, it's not impossible, but... and the whole thing, very mysterious, but this is what's brought in the Seder Adoris. I don't know what to tell you. So the mobs They go from one city to another, killing, massacring, stealing, plundering, destroying, burning. Did they give the Jews a chance to convert? So historically, it's interesting to analyze each of the massacres, each of the pogroms. Every time we suffered at the hands of anti-Semites, was it die or was it die or convert? So, the Inquisition in 1492, they gave a giddush, it was an expulsion. It wasn't die or convert. You want to be a Jew, just not here, and leave all your money behind. It was an expulsion. You could be a Jew, just not in our land. You want to stay, it's on our terms of conversion. Now, it doesn't justify, of course, the actions of the Inquisition, but this was officially, that's... We know the Almohades. You think 1033 in Fez was horrible? Apparently, while the Second Crusade happened in 1147, which by the way, that's when Rabbeinu Tam, they came. The Second Crusade was more in France than Germany. They came to Rabbeinu Tam, who was in Romero, and they stabbed him. They pierced his head, wounded his head 5 times, and he was bleeding to death. Right? And people ask, how is Rabbeinu Tam still alive with 5 wounds in his head bleeding? Rabbeinu Tam had a big head. Rabbeinu Tam had a big head. Anyway, he was dying over there. And the mob was chanting, kill the leader of the Jews. And there was one nobleman there, Rabbeinu Tam tells him, if you get me out of here, I'll pay you off big time. So the nobleman tells the mob, you want to kill this guy? Give him to me. I'll convert him. If I convert Rabbeinu Tam, could you imagine how many Jews will convert? So the mob backed off. Rabbeinu Tam paid off the guy and he fled. He went to Troy, where his head Rashi had lived. That was during the Second Crusade. Apparently, during the Second Crusade, while that was happening in France, in Europe, apparently Fez had a massacre that was so awful, it made the 1033 massacre just disappear off the map into oblivion. The numbers are staggering. Apparently, what happened then, it was the Almohades, those that the Rambam and his family were fleeing from. They were in southern Spain, in Cordova. That's where the Rambam fled, right? He was around the age of Bar Mitzvah then, and they fled north. They fled north. For about 10 years, the Rambam and his family were fleeing through the northern part of Spain. But the southern part of Spain and the northern Africa, these Almohades were mad. And they were just killing, and apparently there were times where they allowed an option of conversion, other times they weren't. It was just murder. So you wonder, during the First Crusades, when these mobs attacked city after city, was it officially convert or die, or was it just die? And as far as I understand, they were both. It depended on who was in the mob. It depended on when and where. It depends who was leading. Depends under which bishop's guidance they were under, how ruthless they were. When they did give a choice to convert, were there those who did? There are always going to be. Historians say whenever it happened in Spain, the numbers of those who chose to convert was much higher than those that were in Germany and France. The Ashkenazi Jews studied less philosophy, and it doesn't mean they were less sophisticated as far as rationalizing everything. As far as their lumdus and as far as their intellect in other areas, they were no less than their counterparts in the Sephardic world. But as far as their emunah, it was more simple, more simplistic. You live a yid, you die a yid. There were those you could imagine that did succumb. Many, though, were kind of forced into it. Especially the younger ones. Kids would be taken to monasteries. Sometimes they didn't even offer you to die. They just schlepped you and threw you, and by osmosis, it kind of just happened over time. However, there were many that chose to die. Many that killed themselves and killed their families around them. And that's what we're going to talk about. Okay, so join me in number 1. The mood has become so somber and melancholic. We need something a little exciting. Join me in number 1. This is from an old manuscript that describes the Gzeirus of 1096. We don't know who authored it. There's a famous manuscript called the Kuntras Gzeiros Tatno, written by the Rishon, the Ra'avon, Rabbi Eliezer Bar Nosson. one of the great Rishonim. This is from another manuscript who the author has never been identified. But v'oid ha'yasham, there was a Bocher Echad, his name was Simcha HaKoyen, the son of Yitzchak HaKoyen. Koyenim. V'ayormuloi. And the Goyim said, look, kvar horgu kulam, everyone's dead, they're all lying naked, because when they would kill people, they would strip them of their clothes, right? And so the Bocher said, b'chachmasai, Amala kol cheftechem, I'll do as you desire. First take me with you to the Hegman, to the nobleman. So they thought, finally one Jew is going to convert, right? That makes it all worth it. They took him b'cheder, a Hegman, to the room of the nobleman. And the nephew of the nobleman was there with them. V'yischilu, and then they started to call b'shem Kusam, started to do their I guess, going to baptize him or something. And the Bocher had hidden a knife. He took out his knife. Vayachrek b'shinu v'alasar hakodesh shel hegman. Guess he gritted his teeth against the officer that was there. Vayitka sakin bebitnoi. And the Bocher plunged the knife into his stomach. Vayipa vayomas. The guy died. Vayifin misham, the Bocher quickly turns around. He finds two other people. He kills them as well. The problem is then his knife broke. I hope he doesn't mind that we're laughing. One? Okay, the element of surprise. Ad shenishbar asakin biyada, the knife broke. And then everyone was running. But when they realized that the Bocher's knife had broke, vayalu olav yargu, then they knocked him down. Shom ner, the Bocher shekidush Hashem, va'asa mashaloi asu shar hakal. He did something that no one else did. So whoever wrote this old manuscript is saying, this Bocher stood out. He's the only one that actually tried to take down some goyim with him. He's not going to die without a fight. But you see the interesting lashon over here. He did mashaloi also shar hakal. Anyhow, but I want to tell you that's the only reference I have to such a story. Unfortunately, it was a rare occurrence. So, halachically, if a Christian says, he has a sword in one hand and the cross in the other, you got to choose the sword. As harsh as it is, you got to choose the sword. It's one of the big three averos that one has to die instead of violating. Murder, gilui arayos, and avodah zarah, you have to die. If one crumbles to the pressure and therefore serves avodah zarah, so the Rambam famously rules that you don't punish the guy. What do you want? The guy's life was in danger. He didn't act appropriately. That's true. He did not sanctify God's name. It's true. You don't punish him. Rabbeinu David, the famous student of the Ramban, disagrees and says, no, they are culpable to punishment. But the standard opinion is the Rambam's opinion that because Velanara loisasa dover, you were forced into it, you don't get punished. You don't get punished. Here's the shaila. Are you allowed to take your own life? If anyhow you have to die instead of serving the avodah zarah, so you have to die anyhow. So let's say the guy has the sword in one hand, the cross in the other. So you have to take the sword halachically, right? So you have to wait for the guy to do it. Why don't you take the sword and do it yourself instead of giving the guy the pleasure? Are you allowed to do that? Are you allowed to take your own life? We'll get soon about your family. What about your own life? So, if you look in number 4, a famous Taisus in Gittin, the story of the couple hundred boys and girls that were taken on a boat from Israel to Rome, and the kids knew why they were being taken, to be slaves for intimacy, and all the kids jumped off.
Girls went first.
Omar Hashem mibosh and Ashiv Mitzulas Yom. The Eibishter said they're all going to be brought back for Tchias HaMesim. The Ravid in his Sefer Kabbalah has a story, the famous story of the four captives, the four great, right before the Rishonim, the four great rabbis that left Pavel to collect money, and they were taken captive by pirates on the Mediterranean. One of them, his name was Reb Moshe. He was there on the boat with his wife and his son Chanoich. His wife was a Yafas Toyer, and I guess the pirate the captain of the ship with his, with his wooden leg and his hook in his hand and his eye patch, right? He desired her. And she saw what was going to happen, so she stood on the edge of the deck and she called out to her husband in Hebrew, if I jump, will I come back for Tchias HaMesim? Like, will this be considered suicide? And her husband called out that Gemara, Omar Hashem, Hashem, so the pasuk can tell him, I'll bring you back from the depths of the sea. So she jumped off. So you have the story in Gittin of this group of kids that jumped off. So, says Tosfos, now by the way, there's a famous story of the Beis Yaakov girls, a group of girls, the 93 girls in Krakow. When the Nazis came to Krakow, they took all the girls of the school with their teachers, and the girls knew they were all being taken to be raped, and they all poisoned themselves and died, the entire group of them, the whole school. It's an old story, which I have seen many, many articles disproving the story. It seems like, there's a lot written about if it happened, if it didn't happen. It's an amazing story. People get such a chayis in disproving these things. Anyhow, but you have the story over here in Gemara. These hundreds of kids, boys and girls that jumped off. Now, suicide, they took their lives, but they did it for a reason. Generally in Torah, ma'abed atzma ladas, if one takes their own life, willingly, wittingly, knowingly, so they're dealt with very severely. Real halacha, there's no aveilus. There was a law in England, you ever heard this? That not only is it illegal, this was from a Christian view, to commit suicide, but if somebody attempted to kill themselves and was unsuccessful, they would be charged for the crime of attempted murder and then killed. So if you tried to kill yourself, you would be accused of attempted murder, and now they would kill you. So instead of putting you into an asylum or to a home to try and treat your illness, to bring a smile to your face, they would kill you. And there was a horrible story. There was a guy who tried to kill himself by slicing his throat. He was caught before he died. So they said, that's it, attempted murder. They wanted to hang him. The problem is when they hanged him, he was able to breathe because of the cut in his throat. So they had a meeting at the moment. What should they do? And they decided, these Chachmei Chelm, they brought bandages or something, just to cover the hole so he wouldn't be able to breathe, so he should die by the hanging. There was someone who witnessed it, and he said, what a stupid society this is. A foolish, a barbaric society this is. Anyhow, but suicide in Yiddishkeit is something very serious. And the question is, when is there wiggle room? When does it become okay? So we've mentioned before, there are some poskim who believe suicide for the sake of repentance. Rabbi Yaakov Emden believes suicide for the sake of tshuva is mutter. Only though if someone did a crime that carries a death penalty, had there been a Sanhedrin, they would kill you, then you could do it to yourself. He speaks a famous tshuva about a married woman who committed adultery willingly and conceived a child. And she wanted to abort the fetus. And he said she can. Why? Because since she was a married woman committing adultery, she's chayiv misa. Had the Sanhedrin killed her, they would kill her and the fetus. You don't wait 9 months till the baby's born, you kill. So, and Rabbi Yaakov says, well, she can do it to herself. So she could jump off a roof and kill herself and the fetus. So if she just wants to kill the fetus, she could do that too. Fascinating logic. Rav Moshe Feinstein comes out with his guns blazing against this Rabbi Yaakov. But you have, the Chidah brings this, that to take one's life, if one committed such an avera, they can. Rabbi Yankov Reisher, the Shavus Yankov, one of the greatest poskim 300 years ago, believes even if you did averas that don't carry the death penalty, as long as you're taking your own life for the sake of tshuva, it's mutter. And then, of course, we have the letter from the Besamim Rosh, and we had a shir about this. Suicide in the most controversial sefer in halacha. It's online. By the way, anyone listening online, there are source sheets available. whether on right, so on the YouTube or on Spotify, whatever there are, there's a link to the source sheets, and you can follow along with us. Although this past hour I've just been saying things off pod, you guys are all getting nervous. We're going to start the papers. All right, we're going to start. Hold on, relax. Yeah, the battery doesn't have all night. So the Besamim Roish, which is a whole controversy as to the authenticity of that sefer, says even if somebody, the issue of suicide is only if you're ma'abed, you're taking away your life for no reason. But if you have a reason, if life is that awful, you can take it from yourself. And that's a very controversial tshuva. Many hold it's a Bob Meiser, the Russian never wrote it, etc., etc. But you have the Rabbi Yankov Reisher believing, as long as it's for tshuva, it's okay. You have Rabbi Yankov Emden saying if one committed a crime that carries a death penalty, then you could administer to yourself what Bezdin would have done for you. But those are all shittas kind of on the fringe, Obviously suicide is never encouraged for those reasons. All of the sudden, though, we come to our topic over here. Here, when you have the Christian in front of you with the cross in one hand, the sword in the other, you have to die. You can't choose the cross. So you're going to die anyhow. Why give the guy the pleasures? Take the sword from him and do it to yourself. This is a different story. I'm not ma'abed, I'm dying anyhow. Why let the guy have the pleasure of doing it? Stech him in the face. I'll do it to myself. Right? So, number 4, says Tosfos in number 4, commenting on the story of the girls and boys that jumped off the boat. Don't you know the story in Avodah Zarah? Chanina ben Tradyon, a sefer Torah was wrapped around him. He was being burnt alive. And there was wool soaked in water on his chest to prolong his agony. And his students told him, Rebbe, just open up your mouth wide. You'll die quicker. I'll guess you'll lose consciousness from the smoke. You'll die quicker. And he said, I would never do that. He said the words, number 4, the third line, better the one that gave it should take it from me. I will not harm myself. In other words, I'm going to die in a few minutes anyhow. If that's God's decision. I won't do it myself. Now what happened, by the way, after that? The executioner asked him, if I add fire and I take off the wool from your chest, will I have a portion of the world to come? And he said, yeah. So Rabbi Chanina ben Tradyon allowed the executioner to hasten up the death. So you say that's different. He wouldn't do it himself, but he would allow the executioner. So then the executioner asked him, should I do it? And he gave the okay. Why didn't he say, I'm not going to have any part of this. I'm going to let God do it. All of a sudden that became okay. So you have to be able to draw the line. I think it's a very thin line between allowing stuff. It's also, he didn't ask the executioner asked him, he gave the okay. Right, in other words, maybe only that. Maybe he couldn't have asked, for sure not do something himself. On the other hand, his students all asked him, why don't you open your mouth? The students definitely thought it's mutter. And he said you can't. So was he telling them halacha? Or is what they said halacha and he was just going beyond the letter of the law? If what he said is halacha, so then what was they thinking? They didn't know. It makes more sense what they said was the halacha, and he said, I want to go beyond the letter of the law. However, Tosfos' shaila is, you see from Chanina ben Tradyon that he said, you don't touch yourself. Wait for God to do it. So what's the pshat in the boys and girls? So says Rabbeinu Tam, okay, it doesn't say who's, but it's Rabbeinu Tam. Hach over here, Yereim hoyu miyisurin, they were afraid of being tortured. By Chanina ben Tradyon, it was either die in a few minutes or die earlier. Then I'll say wait for God to do it. Here, it's the boys and girls took their life not before the Romans killed them, but before the Romans tortured them. It's a different story. What's his raya? Because it says in Ksuvas, Ilmal, if they would have hit Hananya, Mishael, V'Azariah, Pol Chulat Salma. Hananya, Mishael, and Azariah were thrown by Nebuchadnezzar into fiery furnace. The Gemara says in Ksuvah something astounding. What does it say? Join me in number 6. I have it for you right over here. Just right over here. Look at number 6. That's what happens when you're in a rush, In the first number 6, the Gemara wants to know what's more severe, death or petch or malchus or being beaten. So the Gemara says, Dilma malchus chomer, maybe malchus in a way is worse than death. Because the Amar Rav said, Ilmole nogdu, if Nebuchadnezzar's men would have whipped Chananim Shavazaria, Pochel Tzalma, they would have bowed to the image. So you have this image of Nebuchadnezzar. Big debate between Rabbeinu Tam and his nephew the Ri. Rabbeinu Tam believes this statue was not Avodah Zarah, it was just personal covet for Nebuchadnezzar. His nephew the Ri argues and believes, no, this was a statue of idol worship. Chananya, Mishael, Azariah were willing to be thrown in the fire and die, right? As the Sikha, right? Ready to die. Amanos Lamus. In order not to bow down to this image, this idol. But says Rav, if the option was not to be burnt, but they would have been whipped, they wouldn't have been able to handle it. They would have taka bow down. So what do you see from there? That being whipped is worse than death, because they accepted death. Harai, they allowed themselves to go in the fire. They would not have been able to handle being whipped. So you see that being whipped is worse than death. So the Gemara says, Rav Sama, the son of Rav Ashi, said to Rav Ashi, you don't see that there's a not every whipping is the same. There's a hakar sheyesh lo kitzvah, hakar she'ein lo kitzvah. There's being whipped which has an ending, and then there's suffering that has no end. Malchus is 39 Malchus. That's not as bad as death. But Hanan, what Rav is saying is they would have been whipped until they bowed. There's no ending in sight. So at some point they would have crumbled and they would have bowed down. But what do you see from here? That if a goy is going to hurt you and there's no end in sight, it's worse than death. It's worse. That's what the Gemara is saying. That's what the Gemara is saying. So back to number 4. By the way, the Gemara has a few ways of learning. It's not so pashut. The Rashba says you have to read it in a different type of sing-song. If they would have whipped Azariah, do you think they would have bowed down to the Tzelem? No, they still would have been whipped. But the fact that Rav had to say that means whipping is a bigger chiddush than death. What Rav meant is they still would have chosen to be whipped. But the fact that Rav had to say that's the Gemara's raya is worse than death. But Taka, they still would have taken the Yisurim. But Al Kaponim, back to number 4, in Tosfos. Tosfos says, what do you see? What Tosfos is proving from that Gemara in Ksuvos? Rabbi Chanina ben Tradyon said, I'll die now, I'll die in a few minutes. I'll let God do it later. But they were worried from suffering. They were worried from suffering. And there was like no end in sight. Then you're allowed to take your own life. It seems like Tosfos is paskening that you're allowed to take your own life when you're afraid of suffering. That's what he says. That's what he says. V'oid, in addition, al karcha chayu ma'aninoisan v'lo hayu harginoisan. The second answer is, by Chanina ben Tradyon, it was either die now or die in 5 minutes. Here, these boys and girls weren't going to be given a choice to choose death in Rome. They were going to be forced into the promiscuity, into the znus. They weren't going to be given a choice. They were going to be forced against their will, right? So it's different than the Chanina ben Tradyon story. But there, it's die in a few minutes from the flames or do it to yourself earlier. Here, it wasn't death versus death. It was the only way out. It was kill themselves now so they don't sin later, even though the sinning would be against their will. That's what Tosfos says there. Look at number 5. Says Tosfos in Avodah Zarah on the story of Rabbi Chanina ben Tradyon. V'al yechabo ba'atzmai. I will not harm myself. Rabbeinu Tam. Dehecha sheyireim. If you're afraid, pen ya'avidum oivdei kechavim la'avera. Says Rabbeinu Tam in number 5. If you're afraid that goyim will force you to do an avera, let's say Gilei Arayis, Kegoin or Avodah Zarah, Al Yedei Yisurim, they will torture you, Shelo Yuchal La'amod Behem, that you wouldn't be able to handle. In other words, Rabbeinu Tam, if you're going to be forced into a crime that you have to choose death, but they're not going to offer death to you. They're going to torture you until you do it. Take your life before. Also mitzvah, not only you're allowed, it's a mitzvah l'chabel ba'atzmai, like the story in Gittin of the kids that were taken for promiscuity and they threw themselves into the water. So number 5, he just says, what was the girl and boy's heter? That since had they been taken, they would have been tortured until they sinned. So there's no choice to choose death. You can kill yourself before. But in number 4, he gave 2 answers. The first one was, if you're afraid of Yisurim, it sounds like if you're afraid of torture, you can die. You can take your own life before. What would be the explanation, the rationale, that you're allowed to kill yourself in order not to endure endless torture? I'll tell you what the rationale might be. There's a simple equation, okay? There's a simple equation. Rabbeinu Tam proved from number 5, from the story of the boys and the girls, right? That one thing we can prove, if you're going to be forced into an Aveira, right, and not be given the choice to die, then you can just apply the death to yourself, right? If you're going to be forced into an Aveira that you would have to die, but the guy is not going to give you that choice, you can do it to yourself. Okay? Which means your life versus Avodah Zarah, take your own life. Instead of violating Avodah Zarah, kill yourself. In number 6, the Gemara in Ksuvas, we saw that the simple reading of the Gemara is Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah would have been allowed to serve idols to avoid suffering. That you would be allowed. Now I will tell you that Ramban also learns the Gemara in Ksuvas that they would have taka bowed instead of suffering, but it would have been against the halacha. It doesn't mean they would have done the right thing, but it proves how harsh Yisurim are that they would have taka chosen the idols. And that is just so difficult, because if even the greatest tzaddikim can't handle Yisurim, so how could God give an instruction that you have? How could God expect and demand that you suffer and suffer instead of worshiping idols? Even the greatest tzaddikim wouldn't be able to hack it. So who's God talking to? Very difficult, Ramban, to say that. The simple reading of the Gemara is that they would have taka bowed down legally, kehalacha, in order to avoid Yisurim. So here's my simple equation. If someone's allowed to take their lives instead of serving Avodah Zarah, and you're allowed to serve Avodah Zarah to avoid endless Yisurim, then you should be allowed to take your own life instead of having to face endless Yisurim. Just a simple cheshbon, right? An equation. Fine. So that's as far as taking your own life for Yisurim. At least what we see clearly is taking your own life instead of Avodah Zarah. Which would mean, according to Rabbeinu Tam, if the guy is coming to you with the sword and the cross, you'd be allowed to take the sword and kill yourself. Maybe not, because why? Because if let God do it himself. But you're taking your life. By Tradyon, it was either let God kill you or just die early. Here, you're killing yourself in order you shouldn't take the cross. But just let the guy kill you in 5 minutes? No, but here I'll tell you, I'm worried that if I wait 5 more minutes, I might choose the cross instead of the sword. No, here's different. No. Here's different in Tradyon. Here you'll say that right now, I'm ready to kill myself. If I wait for the guy to do it, I may fall and I may choose the cross. So you'll be able to take it yourself. The shaila is, let's say you're allowed to do that. Burn yourself down in your house before the goyim get there. What about your families, your wife, and your kids? There's a sefer known as the Machane Chaim, Reb Chaim Sofer. He's a student of the Chassam Sofer. I don't think he was actually related. He believes that, what the message of the Akedah is of Avraham and Yitzchak? That want us to be prepared for the right time, not only to take their own life, but even the life of their child, if necessary. It's a very harsh thing, but this is what happened during the first crusade. Join me in the second, number 6. This is from Rabbi Yosef Kaira in the Bedek Habayis. Says Rabbi Yosef Kaira. The Bedek Habayis is what Rabbi Yosef Kaira added onto his base Yosef. At the end, the Bedek Habayis is, to fix the house. There's any loose ends or any things he wanted to add. He writes like following. He quotes from the Sefer Orchos Chaim. There's a medrash called Bereishis Rabbah. It says in Parshas Noach, Hashem tells Noach, "Va'aches dimchem lenafshe seichem v'gomer," that I will seek out your blood for your soul. The medrash says, read it as if it's saying, I will seek out your nefesh for your blood. If someone takes their life, God will hold them accountable. Azhara l'choynikas nafshe, if one strangles himself. Yochel, you may think, afilu like Hananiah, Mishael, v'Azariah. Talmud loymar ach, you might think, really? If you could never take your life, maybe what Hananiah was also a problem? No, ach always excludes. Pirish b'shas hashmat, the time of decrees, yochel limser atzma lemissa, you're allowed to give up your life. V'laharoiges atzma. Now this is not clear in the Medrash. This is the Orchos Chaim interpreting. One can take their own life. Imu yari, if you're afraid, shelo yuchol lamed b'nesoyin. What that could mean is that when the test actually comes, you're worried you may not choose death. You may choose the actual sin. Then earlier on, when you're inspired and you're encouraged and you have the wherewithal and the motivation and the conviction, you could take your own life. Now, how do you see the Chanina, Mishael, v'Azariah? Because they were cast in by Nebuchadnezzar. Well, the Bechlal says that these three rabbis, Chanina, Mishael, v'Azariah, they didn't have to be in Bovel at the time. They were warned before. They could have left. They chose to stay. They chose to stay, so maybe it's considered like it's somewhat active. The Medrash continues, V'chein yachol afilu k'Shaul ben Kish. Maybe when God says that the suicide will be held accountable, maybe, what about Shaul? You know the famous story of Shaul? Shaul was being hunted down by the Plishtim in a war against the Plishtim, and Shaul knows that they have discovered his hiding place. He asks his Noisa Kalov, his attendant, to kill him. The guy says, no, I can't do that. So Shaul puts his sword on the ground. He falls on it. It seems to be a botched suicide, because later on he was killed by someone who was a son of a Ger Amaleki. The story of Shaul's death has so many halachic sugis intertwined in it. The fact that after the Plishtim found him, they severed his head, they hanged his body. A group of Jews found his body and it says they burnt it. The Radak says one opinion is they cremated the body. They cremated the body of Shaul, because the flesh had started to rot. It was so unbecoming for them to see the king in such a state. They burnt his flesh, and of course I've seen many reform people. Oh, they quote the Shaul. You see, you're allowed to do cremation. You're allowed to do cremation. The fact that the one that actually killed Shaul, the son of the Ger Amaleki, when he told David, "I killed your nemesis," David killed him. And on what basis did he do that? It's a whole sugya on its own. And of course, Shaul's suicide itself. How was he allowed to do that? So the Medrash says, B'chal Yochel, you might think when God says none of the suicide, you would think even Shaul, like that type of action is forbidden. And the Orchos Chaim explains, if you're afraid, Shema Yasu Lo Yisudim Koshim, they can give you awful torture. That you're allowed to give up atzmai lemissa. Talmud loymar ach. That you're allowed to do that. In other words, you would think that even Shaul's conduct is part of God's warning, don't do suicide. So it says ach, to exclude that you'll be allowed to take your life in order not to suffer endless yisudim. So you have clear that option over here. Umikan, from here, Mevi'in Raya. So far we have, you can be like Chanina, Mishael, v'Azariah. You could take your life instead of doing the Avera of Avodah Zarah. Even though they may offer you the option of death later. So why do it to yourself? Do what Chanina ben Tradyon said. Let the Eibush to do it. But I'm worried I won't stand b'nesoyin. At the time comes, I won't let them kill me. But if now you're ready to do it to yourself. And the other thing is, if you're worried for Yisudim Kashim. Umikan, from here, they bring a raya, those that shecht kids b'shas hashmad, it's not just you, it's your children. But v'yesh oisim, some say you can't, and they explain the Talmud Lomer ach. They say the Medrash means something else. You can't kill yourself. I, Chanina, Mishael, v'Azariah, they gave themselves over to others. They didn't do it themselves. Even according to the Reed that they were able to flee and they chose to stay, it's still passive. That's called Mosru Atzon B'Yad Acherim. Choosing to remain in that valley and not fleeing is considered maybe Mosru Atzon B'Yad Acherim, but they didn't do it themselves. And Shaul ben Kish Shaloi B'Ratzon Chachamim Asa. Says the Chachamim Chaim, some Rishonim believe Shaul was wrong. He had no permission to kill himself. He was wrong. He was wrong. Umayse's story Barav Echad who shechted many kids b'shas hashmad. Allegedly, this happened during the First Crusade. It is true that the Third Crusade was very much intertwined with the story of Richard the Lionheart, 1189, England, when he was. There was the coronation of Richard. A number of Jews came to be there to pledge their allegiance. The Christians were highly offended. What's the Jew doing here? And there was a massacre that day. A number of Jews were killed. And it led that in the beginning of the next year, 1190, the massacre of York, where all the Jews there were in a tower, the Tower of York, and they all died and they killed themselves. There was a fellow there, Rabbi Yom Tov, who was a student of Rabbeinu Tam. I guess he knew Rabbeinu Tam's shitta was, then you better kill yourself before the Goyim get to do it. And there was him, and there was a big gvir by the name of Yosker, and they killed their families, and then they set fire to the building and they died. There were a couple survivors who didn't die in the fire. They were just taken out by the mob and murdered outside by the mob. So this could have happened there, it could have happened by the First Crusade, but there's a story, a Rav shechted many kids b'shas hashmad, because he knew that these kids would be taken to the monasteries, and they would be raised as Christians. It was definite. And the Goyim wouldn't give them a choice to die. They would just break the kids' endurance day after day, and the kids would just succumb. They're kids, what do you want from them? And so he killed them. Yaharik Val Yava, right? They have to die. And there was another Rav who screamed at him, and he said, "You're a murderer." And the first guy was Loi Chosh L'Dvarav, said, "I don't care what you say, I'm doing the right thing." And the Rav Hamoneya, the second rabbi, said, "If I'm right, then the first rabbi will die in an awful death." And that's what happened. The Goyim grabbed him, they peeled off his skin and put choil, sand, between the skin and the flesh. And yeah, he died an awful death. And afterwards, the Gzeira was bottled. And if the first rabbi didn't shech the kids, it could have been that the kids would have all remained good Jews. So that's a famous Beis Yosef, that he brings this Orchos Chaim, the famous debate of these two rabbis. And it depends on how you learn that medrash about taking your life. Taking your life before you're confronted with the cross and or the sword.
Where the first rabbi also had some indication that you're being a little too overboard. It wasn't exactly like the Romans taking the girls and boys on the ship. There was room for the second rabbi to say, don't do it, because it's not for sure that they're going to.
So there's two things. The question is, was the second rabbi's problem the fact that you want to take your life, Mela, but how could you take the life of others? Or it's even on your own life. Even on your own life. Right.
Even on your own life, listen, I'm not going to tell, but,
no, but
don't take the kids, you're not necessarily doing what's right, because there's a lot of...
Apparently, well, because like what happened, it says came through. But I wonder, because the second opinion says that the Medrash allows you to act like Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah as far as allowing yourself to be killed, but not even killing yourself. So then the issue is not only killing others, even killing yourself. It's almost like a package deal. If you could take your own life, you could take the life of others. If you can't do either. But it's fascinating that it says here that the second opinion says Shaul was wrong. If you look in the Radak in number 7, the Radak says, Afal Pikein, the Radak on the story in Shmuel, he says, Shaul didn't sin. Shaul knew he would die anyways, b'milchama. Shaul knew he was going to die. Because Shmuel told him, when Shaul went to the woman, the witch, right, his aunt, and he spoke with Shmuel. Shmuel said, Macharat, tomorrow you're with me. He knew he was dying anyhow. The Oid, in addition, So it's almost like if you know you're for sure going to die anyhow. But Rabbi Chanina ben Tradyon, the whole story there was he was going to die anyhow, and he said, I'm not going to bring it earlier. I want
We're going to possibly take in.
So Va'oid, he says, he knew that the archman of the Plishtim had found him, and he couldn't hide from there too much longer. He said, better I kill myself. V'lo yis'alulu boy ha'arelim. He knew that if they found him, what would they do? They would torture him.
Parade him around.
In
the torture.
Right. So the Radak is saying very clearly that, seemingly, if you know that you're going to be tortured endlessly, especially if you know you'll be tortured endlessly until they kill you. Now, Rabbi Chanina ben Tradyon was dying through torture. So isn't that the same thing? He's being tortured endlessly until he dies. It's literally the same thing. Why was that any better than being tied to a horse and paraded around town till your body falls apart, God forbid? So then the whole Rabbi Chanina is not, if the halacha is like his students and he was going beyond the letter of the law, then his whole thing is not really... Rabbi Natam seems to say that is the halacha, unless you're worried that you might be pushed.
I think
the truth is the whole... Okay.
Yes, they were keeping him alive for long.
So he's suffering, it's Yisurim. Look, in number 4, it's very strange. It says the girls were worried that they would be tortured. But Chanina ben Tradyon was only worried about death. No, he was being tortured to death. Unless that's considered shorthand torture, because it's only a matter of minutes till you die. So that's called Yisurim Sheyesh Lahem Kitzur. If you're being burnt to death, so it only takes a short amount of time. So the torture that you suffer before you die is called Yisurim Sheyesh Lahem Kitzur. I don't know. But that's what the Radak says. He says, A, he knew he was going to die. B, he was worried about Yisrael, that they would play with him and do who knows what. Yeah.
Say someone who does something like Kiddush Hashem he doesn't feel any pain, so then...
The Maram of Rottenburg says you won't feel pain, but I guess sometimes that applies. Rabbi Yosef Engel asks how that fits with the story here of Chanina ben Tradyon. He doesn't answer. Join me on the next page. The top of the next page, that was also a number 6. We'll just cut off. This is a comment from the Knesset Hagdolah. He says, what the Bedek Habayis brings from the Orchos Chaim, that Shaul ben Kish acted without the will of the rabbis. He's saying Shaul was wrong. Shaul was chosen by God. Hashem told Shmuel, and Hashem told him through Shmuel, tomorrow, right? Shaul heard a day before he died, Macher Ata, you're going to be with me with Shmuel b'mechitzasi. Shaul was a tzaddik. How could it be he took his life illegally? So it must be Shaul was right, he says. The issue is you can't prove from Shaul. Because Shaul knew he wouldn't live anymore. Because Shmuel said, you're going to die tomorrow. And therefore he said, better I kill myself instead of the Plishtim belittling my body. The exact thing the Radak said. A, he knew he was going to die the next day, and B, he knew the Plishtim would do who knows what with him. He's torture him while he was alive. So Ava, but he said if it's a suffix, he says if you have a question that if you don't kill yourself you may survive, if there's any hope that by staying alive you may remain alive, you have no right to kill yourself. So it sounds like from the Knesset Hagdolah as well, if you know you're for sure going to die, that's just the natural course of things. Unless you'll say, what do you mean natural course? Even if there's a sharp sword on your neck, never hold yourself back from rachamim. But maybe when God tells you dying tomorrow, there's no way out. But there is. There is. That's what Chizkiah told Yeshaya in the Gemara Brachas. When he said, Afilu cherev chad, it's talking about a gzeira from God. When he heard from the prophet Yeshaya, you're dying. So why is it that when Shaul heard from Shmuel, tomorrow you're with me b'mechitzasi, there's no way out? He couldn't break the decree? What's your question?
Hashem goes back in his back.
Right. So how do you ever know for sure? Yeah, what's your question? Okay, you say he was a king, and that's another simple answer. Chil Hashem, because he was a king. The Marshal in number 9, look what he says. V'ulai, he says, Shaul olav hashalom. When he fell on his sword, you know what he was thinking? He said, if I fall into the hands of the Plishtim alive, they'll be mis'alel with me. They'll torture my body. What will the Jews do? They won't be able to hold themselves back to hear that the king is being subjected to such Yisurim. And they will, they will galvanize together to take Nekama from the Plishtim, and who knows how many tens of thousands of Jews will die. I can't let that happen. He knew the Jews would all stand up for him. So he said he knew that. And he knew anyways that there was a Gzeir against him, he's going to die. So it's either him, if he gets taken by them, he's going to die anyhow, plus 10,000 Jews. If he kills himself, it's just him. And in order to save the nefesh of others, you're allowed to kill yourself. He finishes, also he was covered Hashem, Mashuach Hashem. It's not fitting, it's a big chilul Hashem. It's a big chilul Hashem to God and to Torah and to Yiddishkeit if the king will be mishandled and belittled. And who knows what they would do to him in the hands of the Plishtim. The affliction, the bizoyan, etc., etc. So the Marshal says that, these two explanations. So you have this big debate, can one take their own lives before the guy sticks the sword into you? Can you take it from him and do it yourself? It seems from a bit of time that you can. And not just do it to yourself, but do it to your wife and kids, especially if you're worried about your kids, that they won't take the sword from the guy. They don't have the wherewithal, they'll just be taken and raised in monasteries. So if you look on number 10, in number 10 there's a story. Vayihi sham bocher echad, there was a bocher. His name was Yitzchak ben Daniel. And they asked him, the Goyim said, do you want to exchange your God for Yoshkin? He said, Chalila, I trust in God and I will resign my soul to him. So they put a rope around his neck and they schlepped him around the entire city in the mud till the church. He was barely alive and they told him, we give you another chance. Do you want to survive? Do you want to convert? And he couldn't even talk anymore because he was practically strangled. But he hinted with his finger and he said, cut off my head. So they did that. And that was the end of his life. So you see that to some people, they tortured you hoping the torture would affect you to cave. So you have Rabbeinu Tam's other heter, right? It seems to say two heterim. That if you know for sure there's going to be the nisayon of doing the Aveira and you're worried you may end up choosing the conversion, you could take your life. Or if you see there's just Yisurim. There's Yisurim coming your way. Like over here. If you look at number 11, this is from the Ra'avon. Rabbi Lezer ben Nosson in his Kuntras of the Gzeiros of Tatnu. Shmuel Bar Yechiel was his name. He had an only child, a Bocher Na, a beautiful boy. He looked like the Levanon, and he ran with his father into the blood. He stuck out his head l'shchita to his father, and his father made a bracha. There's quite a few testimonies to this taking place. When one shechted another, they would make a bracha. He made a bracha ala shchita, and the son said Amen. And all of those that were there answered B'kol Ram, Amen. And then he slaughtered the boy. Shema Yisrael, he says, Ru'u, all the boy Olam, they saw how great was the child, that he's greater than Yitzchak, because Yitzchak was bound. Yitzchak was bound. He's B'li Akod. He wasn't bound. He was Nishchat. And imagine the koyach of the father, that his mercies, he had to hold them back on the Bocher Noam V'Yofa. Then we have number 12. Number 12 again is from this old manuscript who the author is hitherto unidentified. This is one of the saddest stories I think you'll ever come across. It's an absolutely awful story. And we really shouldn't be reading it, but no, this is mamish, this is forget about heartbreaking. This is completely it's traumatizing. V'sham hoysa isha chashuva. There was a woman, her name was Rachel, the daughter of Yitzchak bar Rebasher. She told her friend, I have 4 sons. Gam aleim al tachusu, don't have pity on them. Pen yim mechuyamim b'tousam, because they will be raised in the monasteries in their beliefs. And also with my children sanctify the name of God. So that's what Rachel said to her friend. Vatove achas mechavrosana, one of her friends came. Vatik achas macheles, and took the knife. Vayhi kasher rosa hamacheles, when I guess Rachel saw her friend with the knife, vatitzak tzak g'daylu mara. She started screaming an awful and bitter cry. Vaysamaka, she was banging on her face, said, God, where's your kindness? And she took her son, Yitzchak b'no HaKatan, and he was noimod, so pleasant. And she shechted him. The chaverta and her friend, Parsa bata yadayim shala, spread her hands, bein shnei achim, between the two brothers. And she said to her friend, Chaychi, wait, al tishcheti, don't shecht Yitzchak before Aaron. There was a boy Aaron. Kishero, when he saw that his brothers were shechted, he was screaming, Imi, al tishchateni, he was screaming, Mama, don't do this to me. V'holach, and he went, v'nechba, tachas teva achas, under a box, under a chair, under a table. She took her two daughters, Bela and Marana, and she shechted them, Hashem Elokeit's voice. And she raised her voice and she called to her son, Aaron, Eifatata, Aaron, where are you? Gamo lecho loyochus, I can't have rachmanis. Vatimahu baraglov, she schlepped him by his feet from underneath the table where he was hiding, and she shechted him lefnei Hashem rom v'nisa. You wonder how barbaric that is. But this boy would have ended up going to a monastery, being brought up as a galach. It's Yaharek Val Yaver, right? Better to choose death. So the mother made that choice for her child. I mean, it's awful. But she placed these kids between her hands by her stomach. They were still in their throes of the bodies were still kalva. What's the word? Kalva. Kalvus. No, there's a word of convulsing. No. Before them. Adashe tofsu hatoyim esached, until the Christians came in and they found her sitting and crying, and they said to her, Harei lonu hamamon sheyesh b'bata yadayach, all the money you have is ours. And then when they saw that the kids were already dead, they hit her and they killed her. That's the story of this Rachel. A horrific story. So in the Crusades became famous, not only these people chose to die, there were many that were forcibly baptized, it's true. Okay. But not only that there were many that chose to die, there were those that took their own lives and the lives of their wives and their children, and there wasn't a small number. In these two works that we have quoted over here, there's quite a few anecdotes and stories of people that it was rampant. What? They're called the Gzeiras Tatno. One was written by the Ra'avon, Rebbe Lezer Bar Nosson, and the other one was found from an old manuscript. We don't know which Rishon wrote it. Didn't put his name to it.
107 sons.
Yeah. Yeah. But here they actually shechted them themselves.
Yeah.
That's so. And this happened during Sfiras HaOmer. The Taz writes, until Lag BaOmer we mourned Rabbi Akiva's students passing, but then they stopped dying. So what's the Avelis after Lag BaOmer? Why is there still Avelis now? The Taz says it's because of the Crusades. That's what he says. Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim stopped dying Lag BaOmer. Over Rachmim was made for the Crusades. That's why we say it. And
Why specifically the Shabbos?
because Over Rachmim was made for the Crusaders, and they died now. They died Iyar and Sivan. There is a machloikus at the Shabbos Mevorchim Iyar, because it's during Nisan. There was a machloikus about that. There's a well-known story. Rabbi Akiva Eger, when he was a young man, he was offered a Rabbana somewhere. And when he came there, the president of the community decided, I got to faher this new rabbi. Now the president was a layman. So he asked Rabbi Akiva Eger, this Shabbos are we doing Over Rachamim? So this guy only knew whatever the minig was over there. Rabbi Akiva Eger said, it's a machloikus. The guy's like, machloikus, what type of amaretz are you? No machloikus. So the president didn't allow Rabbi Akiva Eger to get the shtela, to get the job. He wasn't. Rabbi Akiva Eiger then gets a position in a different town. Later on, the president of this town happens to be in the city where Rabbi Akiva Eiger is now rabbi. He walks into the shul and he sees a rabbi giving a big pilpul, and he looks closely and says, I know this guy. This is the guy who tried to get the job by us, and I caught him out in a simple question. This guy's Amoris, now he's giving pilpulim. So afterwards, he went over to Rabbi Akiva Eiger and he said, between you and I know that you're not shaykh to be rabbi over here. I know the truth. The pilpul that you said was great, where'd you get it from? He said, I got it from the Ov HaRachamim. I got it from the Father in heaven, the Ov HaRachamim. Right, that's why there's an Indian to say it. The Shabbos Mevorchim Sivan as well, it happened now. But it's incredible. The Taz says that the Avelis after Lag B'Omer is taka not for Rabbi Akiva's Talmid and Poskum Elamus. It's because of Bechlal, the Avelis. When did it begin? The Rambam doesn't bring it. The Avelis Bechlal. There's a lot more to talk about. The reason why the Crusades happened now, the reasons why Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim died now is because this time is a Yemei Adin already from times of memorial, going all the way back. It's a preparation to Matan Torah. It's a time of Din. Rabbeinu Yerucham talks about it. It's a time of judgment. It's a harsh time. That's why all these calamities happened. It could be once the Crusades happened, then we urged to realize, how serious. So then we said, let's do Avelis for Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim, because Taka in Spain, the Rambam doesn't quote any minig of Avelis during Sfira. It could Taka be after there's people have tried to investigate when the Minhagim began. I'll just end off with this. The Minchas Elazar from Munkach, okay, the Munkach Rebbe, he famously quotes from his Zayda. He heard people quoting his Zayda, the Bnei Yisachar, the Dinner Rebbe, that he had a tradition that many of the Baalei HaTosfos who were murdered in Germany, he doesn't say by which massacre. 1096 is very early. I mean, Rashi's still alive. Rashi dies in 1105. Rashi's students, I guess, they're Baalei Tosfos, they were alive. It's not clear which massacre he refers to. Maybe it was the Second Crusade, maybe it was the Rindfleisch massacres, maybe it was something else. But he says that so many of the Baalei Tosfos were murdered by Christian mobs, and the night before, some of these Baalei Tosfos, or a group of them, were in some castle of some duke, and they were surrounded by the mobs, the hooligans, knowing that by tomorrow the mobs will have infiltrated, and the choice will be convert or die. And they knew that. And the night before, they were learning a Sugya Masechta Baba Kama in Perek Merubah, and there are some hefty Tosfos there. It was written the night before. It was written the night before. So you wonder, how could it be at the lowest point of their lives they reached such heights? And the answer is that it was, called the lowest point of their lives. To die al Kiddush Hashem, as far as this is one of the greatest heights a person can reach. As Rabbi Yosef Kaira very much desired to die like his friend Rav Shlomo Molcha, and he was told by the Magid, you will die like al Kiddush Hashem, like your friend Rav Shlomo. Until something happened, Beis Yosef lost his chus. And the Rebbe would talk about this often. That the tremendous chus. So the fact that they wrote these incredible titles the night before, it's not ironic. It fits. This was their highest point in their life. And that's why they reached the highest point in their learning. How they were able to concentrate, that you have to wonder. But of course, this is from the vantage point of a Jew connecting to God. From the Eibishter, you wonder why the Eibishter allowed all these things to happen. Calamity after calamity. You'll say it's Golus. But, when Avraham was told about his Einokach being Golus, did he see all this? The Eibishter showed Moshe all the catastrophes that would happen in the future. The Golus is Golus, but the Eibishter has made it pretty bitter. Anyhow, the Eibishter, we've had, as the Kotzker would say, the Eibishter has turned us into Morah fressers. We fresh Morah all the time. One tzara, another tzara. It's time already for the Eibishter to take away the Morah and bring something sweet. The Mashiach Zol Shan Kumen. Okay.